Thank you for tuning into the Odd Thoughts podcast. My name is Gunther, and I am your host, and welcome to episode 8. If you're someone who likes to discuss the everyday odd thought, then appreciate you tuning in. I hope to offer a semi-informative, semi-entertaining type content, and if that's something that you really enjoy, then please keep tuning in. For today's topic, I'm trying to do my due diligence, trying to like bounce between different topics as I upload per week. I'm trying to just aim for two right now, and I'm trying to aim for maybe one or two more. So, but for right now, I'm gonna try to bounce between like one podcast being maybe something that deals a little bit more into mental health, or something that deals a little more personal like that, or and then doing the other thing and doing the other podcast as something that's maybe a little more fun or something that I can enjoy, or do have a little research into a little bit more too. So today's topic I thought would be kind of fun to talk about. My top, I did my top four favorite rap albums or hip hop albums, however you want to say it. I didn't really discover, or not discover, but start listening to rap until later in my life. I was probably like a senior in high school, and so I was. It's the first thing, kind of genre of music also that I took like a deep dive into. It was the first genre that I kind of like, listened to what was popular, and then kind of started basing my all these things like. As I listened to artists and did like watched interviews and found out what influenced them, then I went back a little further and went back a little further. So I thought that would be kind of a fun topic for today for episode 8. But before that, how's everybody doing? Is everybody doing okay? I know I'm doing okay. Every day, I'm trying to just be a little bit better. Something that a sentiment that I keep trying to spread. I keep trying to put into the ether for sure. And I realized that I got to kind of speak positively to think positively, and it's not easy. It really is not always that easy. I struggle trying to put that positive energy out there. I struggle trying to have like good sentiments to myself in my life, and so if I have to have that subconscious, thought that I'm gonna have a good day, that I got to speak a little bit positively, and with the with something with the podcasting and doing other things, like I'm holding myself accountable, and I'm showing up every day for it, or trying to show up every day for it, and in whatever way that may be. If I'm not like actively recording, I usually have a tendency to try to like research a little bit, or I have a lot of fun trying to create like the different graphics for like my like podcast. Like I just redid. I have it for this episode. I'm pretty sure. I hope I do at least if I remember. I have a new intro and a new outro, or at least a graphic, not the song. I'm gonna keep that song. I kind of like it. And then I'm trying to work on that kind of stuff, and I know I vary it a lot, so I have a worry that I'm gonna burn myself out. But I don't really mind, I guess, recycling that kind of stuff, recycling the graphics, because there's some nice graphics, and and replaying on the ideas, kind of the basic outlines of those graphics. So yeah, and also just making sure that I kind the whole sentiment of making sure that I'm keeping myself busy too. That's something that I'm also like keeping at the forefront of my thought is keeping myself busy with things, and and today's day and age, as I get a little older, I learned that like I rely more on things that distract me, I guess, a little bit. I'm okay with being alone at times, but I do get lonely. I really do. It's hard to fight that like lonesome feeling. So, and whether it be like I want friends, or like whether it refers to dating or anything like that, like I get lonely. But if I feel things in my life, it'll only do so much. But at least I can feel good about that. So I'm keeping it going, keeping it rolling, keeping it moving. And I hope everybody else is doing the same kind of stuff at least, filling your day up with whatever it may be, and hopefully things that bring you peace of mind. Nothing toxic. Yeah, it's hard to avoid the toxic a lot of times. It's like it's if you meet someone that lives a pretty like 0% like toxic life, you know, a little questionable. Not really, obviously. There's some good people who manage to avoid that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, yeah, I think everybody, it's still the sentiment of trying to just have something to fill in like those empty spaces, whatever those empty spaces may be. And so I'm gonna continue to do so. And as the podcast is helping me, and I really do appreciate all the people that have been listening to the podcast too. I'm keeping it going, and I'm trying to spread out my vision, or like my like how I can be seen, and I just want to like do the best I can. That's really the goal at the end of the day is as long as I can listen back to these episodes and I feel good about it and I feel like, I've done something that I'm confident in to an extent, then I'm good. I'll feel good. And I'm trying to keep these really generally pretty unedited, as if you can't tell. Because I just want it to be like a really off the top kind of flow. I just really want to try to like keep things super fresh, even if I'm like keeping stockpiling ideas or like I've got these things kind of listed. I still want to be able to try to think of these things pretty off the dome, and not try to like rehearse too much of the podcast. Like when I before I turn on the mic, I do a little like mini like trying to talk to myself and try to amp myself up, try to get myself going. So yeah, that's and that helps me, but I still get nervous. I do get nervous. Um, but yeah, let's move. Okay, just making sure that everybody knows that there are things out there, and it's hard to sometimes put yourself into it, and especially like nowadays, like feels like a lot of things take a financial commitment. Like to do the podcasting, I had to buy like a computer and I had to buy a microphone, and I know that eventually it will all pay off and stuff like that, but like it is something that like at first I didn't want to like jump into and spend the money on, and it was hard. Like talking myself out consistently of trying to do these things like because like I just couldn't justify it or whatever. But like, it doesn't have to be this for everybody, right? It doesn't have to be you don't have to spend money on that kind of stuff. But and also I think the loneliness sentiment is I think a lot of people can do that. Even if you're with someone, there are times when you're left alone to your own thoughts and that can get a little intimidating. So anything to kind of take me out of that, and I think anything to take y'all out of y'all's, in any piss poor, or not, piss poor. That's just not a really good way to say that. Sorry, but just any bad mindset, just a negative mindset. Yeah, but we'll keep it moving. So like I said, today's episode 8, I wanted to talk about my top four. I said, it's I always get like iffy on the top, like three, top four kind of that kind of listing because usually I have like a number one in mind, but I always feel like I struggle sometimes with like then going down to two, three, four, five, whatever, as far the list will go. So I came up with four. I came up with the top four, I think, and top four favorite rap albums. And um, like I said, I didn't discover rap until later in my life. I was probably like, yeah, I would say my senior year of high school. It was just like the friends I was kind of hanging out with, and then like, when I kind of graduated high school and I started working out started working. I started working the restaurant business, and that kind of like, I kind of got like I always loved like the restaurant business in the way that like you can work with like tons of different people from different walks of life. So I started like meeting people that were also like, that's just kind of the music they listened to, and excuse me, sorry. But at first it was kind of just like cuz I didn't really have like a basis of like what was rap music, what was hip hop or whatever. Like I didn't know anything else. I didn't know anything about it. So like it was only what was on the radio. I feel like it was only like artists that were kind of popular at the time, 2013, 2014 when I was a senior in high school, which would have been like, Drake or Kendrick or Mac Miller or like, Two Chains or Future or like even like I love like Big Sean or something like that, or like or Ray Shremmerd. Like at that time, like I would listen to. I think my motivation more so for listening to rap music was like the beats. I really loved instrumentals, and that's something I think I kind of took with like songs as I grew up too. Like I was always such a big fan of metal music because of my dad. And a lot of I mean, I can go with without a lot of those lead vocalists. It's not always like the nicest sounding people. There's a lot of great metal vocalists, but not all of them, especially around that like 80s hair band era. But I love like the guitars and the drums and I love the instrumentals. So I think I kind of took that into like the general sentiment like, when I was listening to any kind of music. And so why would it be different when it came to that? When it came to me trying to listen to rap music? And so that was kind of the what I took in first, and I just listened to what was popular, and I wasn't really always like a fan of music necessarily. Like I know that's always kind of a weird to say, but I never hated music. Like I was in choir for a long to like a lot of years of school, like, and so like I was always doing music like sorry, but I was always doing music, and when I grew up, like my dad listened to metal music, and my mom listened to like she was like a pretty heavy like radio songs and and alternative bands, and then I had like a teenage sister also while I was growing up, so whatever I listened to a lot of things like from like the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and that kind of was a sentiment of me growing up too, is those things really stuck into my brain. So rap music was the first time that I took a dive into anything. It was the first time that I like kind of sat there and was like, oh, this is kind of something that I think I'm actually interested in. And it's something that that's different than what I've listened to before. And nobody in my family listens to, like, at least at that time, wasn't really listening to rap music like that. So it was pretty like, whatever. And then eventually like it started to kind of evolve. And I would say like maybe about when I probably reached about like I was like 19 or something like that. I had a friend of mine that was like really into like a wide variety of music. Just like, knew a lot about a lot, and specifically knew a lot about rap music and stuff like that. And so like one night we were chilling at his house, and I was just thinking like I wanted to know like what if I was gonna listen to old school hip hop, if I was gonna keep going back, then what should I listen to? Because I was maybe at that time kind of feeling like a little stunted on what was new. I didn't feel like the scene was stunted. I just felt like I kind of got what I wanted out of like new music. So like I'm always the type of person that like when I enjoy a celebrity, I find like a new musician or athlete, like I dive into their backstory or try to a little bit. I'll do a little research or whatever it may be, and so interviews pop up a lot, and these rappers would talk about some of their influential albums, some of the albums that influenced them. And so you start to notice like, a lot of them had the similar albums, and then I'd go back a little further, and then, you know, artists from like the 2000s would talk about like stuff from the 90s, and then so I just try to like I was like kind of like picking up on these notes, and so I just wanted to ask like not an expert necessarily, but someone who knew at least a little bit more than I did, a lot more than I did. And so he started just naming off like a bunch of like whatever, like, he's Most Def, or he was talking about like Wu Tang, or he was talking about like Dr. Dre, or he was just saying he was saying whatever. And then he was like, oh, hold up, like I got the perfect album. And so we went inside, and he busted out his record player and busted out his records, and we busted out specifically a record by the Beastie Boys called Paul's Boutique. And if you ever listen to Paul's Boutique, it's pretty innovative album in the way of like it was like the first not the first album, but like it was an album that heavily sampled, which today there's a lot of like that like in between on copyright issues and what how much of the sampling you can use, and so but at that time the Beastie Boys really took a big step with that, and it's still to this day like the most it's like, has the most samples out of any like album ever. I'm pretty sure like it's like 300 or something like that. It's pretty crazy. But when you listen to the album, it's a pretty long album, but it's so coercive. It's so like cohesive, and it just like keeps it like moving, and songs kind of run together. And I remember sitting down and listening to that, and maybe it was just like being in the right mindset, you know what I'm saying? Like, but I loved it. I absolutely fell in love with that album, and that got me excited to kind of listen to like hip hop and like rap and stuff like that. And so I, pretty clichély decided I was like, oh, I'm just gonna like look up like greatest like hip hop albums of all time, like or most influential more so. And I just like looked up a list, and kind of just started like noticing the similarities more so, not differences, similarities between different lists. And so it started off with like buying just like pretty classic albums, and I had to like know what sounds there were. And that was kind of like the big thing, is like that's with everything, is you got to discover like the little subsets of the genre a little bit. Kind of like what's the sound you like? What did you get out of these things? And like I said, it was at first it was a lot of a lot of beats out of the rap music. That was kind of what I wanted. And then when I started listening to old school hip hop, the beats are great, but it's one of those things where they weren't like I didn't feel like they were like as engineered, or like didn't feel like it was like as like good as maybe newer songs. Even like I always feel like, like infinitely, even though there are these great beats from the past of hip hop, I still feel like a lot of the newer beats are like going to be infinitely maybe better in a way. That's a controversial like statement, because there are some trash beats, but it's just like there's a sound to it. But I didn't have but when I went back and I started listening to old school hip hop and rap, I made sure I didn't have like that mindset of like, oh, I'm listening to the beats. The purveyor of, old school hip hop is like there was some innovation to it, and yeah, some of it was beats, but there was a really big kind of like, storytelling aspect, and it was kind of and it was in rap, always it stands for rhythm and poetry, right? So it's always that kind of like, broken down, rhythm and words, you know what I'm saying? Like beats and words. And so that's kind of, I just had to think of it simplistically when I went back, and I started realizing that like I can get where like a lot of these influences that rappers have nowadays, I get where they come from. You understand where some of these sounds kind of come from. And so it probably was around that time, yeah, about like 1920 when I really started diving into it. And I would go to movie trading company or wherever, and I'd just buy like CDs because like I didn't have a record player, so I bought CDs and I just started diving like nose head first and buying stuff like Nas's Illmatic or Wu Tang or doing like The Chronic, Dr. Dre, and then buying stuff like that, like classic, like literally cliche kind of classic albums. And then just going off from there and realizing, there's so much to the West Coast, so much to the East Coast, when the South, finally came in and when the Midwest kind of came in. And so, like, that's the fun thing is getting to bounce around like all these different styles. So, after a bunch of listening, and I know I'm going to keep on listening to rap and I'm always going to keep on, enveloping. And like I said, that even like a top four list that I'm going to say, like, I don't, I could say my number one. I know the first one I'm going to say is my number one for sure favorite album, but like I said, it usually falls off and it's kind of hard to like always, precisely, pinpoint people's positions or albums' positions. So like I got a top four, and I'm always gonna want to talk about it more. So I know that in future episodes I'll have a chance. But without further ado, just giving a little background on how I kind of discovered rap music, hip hop. My top five. I guess I can also say like my top five favorite rappers. I'll go with not my top four, my top five. You know what I'm saying? Mix it up. My top five favorite rappers. I'll probably say Andre 3000 is number one for sure. Number two, I'd probably say Nas. It's kind of a cliched classic list, you know. I always, why I'm shit on myself. I don't know why I do that. Like, I like what I like. My number three, I would say, is Kendrick Lamar. And that's in the last couple of years. Like, he's kind of definitely like come up in that. I'd say my number four is probably Q-Tip. A Tribe Called Quest. If you know who Q-Tip is, producer and rapper, like very fantastic. He'll pop up on this. It's just same as Nas and Andre 3000 will literally pop up on this list. And then my number five, I probably will have to say I'd probably say it's Drake. And I know it's like what, but Drake, he's just been good for a long time, and he was around when I started listening to it, and he's still around. So, and he's very prevalent, and I'm like, and I can switch up that top five pretty consistently. My number one will always be Andre 3000, no question in my mind. But yeah, like I said, I can always switch up, and those aren't solidified numbers sometimes. Okay, let's keep it going. So I'm gonna do my top four favorite rap albums, and so for number one, like I said, my number one is pretty like consistent, and that's Outkast's Aquemini by Outkast, if you want to put it more so that way. It literally was like probably one of the I discovered it after like a few albums I had bought maybe like six other albums, and I didn't really like I only knew Outkast from what was like popular at the time, right? Like I only knew what Outkast was from like the hits, and I mean I knew their hits, like and I love those songs, and I kind of knew Andre 3000 through like he'd been in a couple movies, right? So I kind of knew him through that, and so I kind of was a little scared because I didn't know like I wanted to listen to like I was really into the boom bap kind of like New York style, like that really jazz influenced style, and so I didn't want to listen to it. And then the first album I bought of Outkast's was AT Aliens. That was the first one I bought. But then when I listened to that, I immediately kind of started falling in love with them, and I was like, wow, I was like all these themes that they were kind of hitting on, and I was that album was very like amazing, and it was their sophomore album. AT Aliens was their second album, and I always say it's like they had the best jump from their first to second album easily. The first album was great, but it was kind of like it just wasn't like maybe like they were kind of fronting in a way. It was they're kind of playing these characters that were maybe true to who they were at the time, but it wasn't like who they would become. And then, doing AT Aliens, they made that jump. And then eventually I would buy Outcast's Aquemini. When I bought Aquemini, it literally was like everything they did on AT Aliens, but like better. It just like honed everything in, and it's this really crazy, like it's a very like outer spacey kind of psychedelic, funky kind of theme. You know what I'm saying? And they brought in a lot of like live instrumentals to do like the album, and so it's just an amazing album. A truly amazing album. And when I think that album, I say it's my number one, not only because it is a beautiful album and Andre 3000 is my number one favorite rapper, but it's an album that changed the way I wanted to listen to hip hop in rap in general. I've offered so much of the storytelling aspect, but also brought in a lot of like this melodic like hooks and adding in a lot of like different like flows and tone and stuff like that. And I think that's what got me really interested is and that's not the sentiment that I feel about like all hip hop necessarily. Sometimes simplicity hits best, but this album offered a good variety. This album, it's called Aquemini, which is it's a portmanteau of Aquarius and Gemini put together, a word blend, if you will, of Aquarius and Gemini, and so I thought that was pretty cool. The Big Boy's an Aquarius, and then Andre 3000's a Gemini. I think maybe it's the other way around. It might be the other way around. Sorry, I should have looked that up. But it was released September 29th in 1998. It was a couple years after AT Aliens, so it was like it kind of felt like every couple of years they just put out these like fantastic albums, and they 100% did. And most of the album was recorded in Atlanta, Georgia, of course, and it was produced by Organized Noise, as well as a man named Mr. DJ, and then Outkast themselves had a pretty heavily hand in it, and Organized Noise I think did like most of their songs. I'm pretty sure most of their albums, and like I said, Big Boy and Andre 3000 always had like their hand in it, especially Andre 3000. He was someone who was really like it felt like in this album too, like Andre 3000 was into the production side of things. He always kind of, I think, maybe looked at it from that kind of like, style, kind of looking from the production in. And then Big Boy created like all these great hooks and like really kind of like came up with a lot of these themes for these album or like these songs. And so it's a great album because it felt like it was two dudes who like are having something to prove. And especially when East and West Coast were really like the popular, like, kind of places for hip hop at the time. And they were trying to do their thing. And they made a statement. I mean, like to beyond a statement. I think in my opinion, the best songs on there, like I'm gonna say, like, and like I said, I'm gonna keep it in my opinion. I would say, literally the title track of Quemini is probably like my favorite track on that album. It's just Andre 3000 has one of the best verses in his second verse, his first verse too, but his second verse as well. But it's just that it's the ultimate encompassment of that like psychedelic, funky vibe that they have in the album, and like very like ethereal. That's kind of like always what it's about. It feels like that's what all of the songs feel very like spacey, and I love that, and they all feed in very well together. Also the the art of storytelling is probably one of my other favorites. Sasha Thumper is just a fun song, and kind of adds like a it's a quicker pace like song too, and I think that would be like what was like more of their sentiment on like their next album, Stankonia. Stankonia was like kind of like more of like kind of like a trappier album, and this one it was still like kind of that because of what like hip hop was at the time. So sorry, golly. But the art of storytelling was like I think a more upbeat song, and then Liberation, that song is like 9 minutes of pure just like ecstasy for real. And that song features Erica Badu and CeeLo Green. Like just so funny to think like how like long they've been around, and like CeeLo Green like kind of like having his hit song in like the early 2010s and whatever, and like he's got you can hear his voice all over that album. And like I said, Erica Badu as well. And then the album also has a feature from Raekwon, and then from Wu Tang, and then also George Clinton, who's a classic, who's a like a fixture in like funk music and stuff like that. And so like that's kind of like I said, that's the portrayal they try to have, was like this the funky psychedelic kind of vibe. And a lot of their songs really were trying to do like they were trying to deal with like harsh realities when it comes to the individual. Kind of like an individualism type thing. And that's what a lot of the songs feel like. It feels like the hardships that a person has to go through. Not necessarily like as we know, there's a collectiveness to realities and harshness of some realities, and there is a collectiveness at times, but it was more so like kind of like it was a storytelling of how they felt about it. And it's in a way they kind of make it seem like even though some of these topics they talk about, I always say like there's some harsh topics and they're very real on what they say, but like the way that the songs play out and the way that they produced and how talented those two gentlemen are, how talented Andre 3000 and Big Boy are, it just really adds like it smooths it out for you. It doesn't make it seem so like impending on you like an impending doom or something like that. And like maybe I overstate it with like how harsh about the stuff it talks about, but like it's a beautiful album, and every song just flows really nicely. And a couple of the bigger like like I thought was a funny fact about it is one of the songs like kind of the bigger like singles off that album was a song called Rosa Parks, and Rosa Parks sued them because of the song because of kind of it didn't promote what they think, the right thing, that and also like you're using her name to kind of in a way exploit, but they didn't mean it that way. Outkast obviously did not mean it that way. And they kind of tried to like, phrase it as they were just kind of informing who Rosa Parks was, and I can get behind that. but just two boys from Atlanta, two friends, two guys that had like a similar vision, some two people who had a similar sound, and they wanted to make something, and they made a great album, and went on to make a few other albums, and they really had a short-lived, I don't know if you call it short-lived. It was like 10, 12 years of like really like solid albums. I'll argue that they probably had one of the best three album like, stretches out of any artist, the AT Aliens, Aquemini, and Stankonia. I'd 100% say that's probably one of the best stretch of three albums that any, artist, individual or group or duo or whatever has had. And I feel like I can really comfortably say that. And then the album became really popular. I think they were just constantly were kind of stepping up to that plate, and this album kind of was the first of like maybe like switching also more into like commercial mainstream sound. And the Synconia is I think where they would really hone that in. Sorry, excuse me for the coughing. I'm trying not to cough too much. Yeah, but yeah, I would say, but like I said, I would say that number one is for sure Aquemini. Outcast is Aquemini. I always like saying it like that because it feels official. All right, but I would say let's keep going. Number two on my list, I would say I probably could say this is comfortably my number two is Illmatic by Nas, and that one is like kind of like a one for the classic like hip hop heads type thing. I even like sometimes I always feel a little like weird for like saying that's like one of my favorite albums because like it was a very like classic album. It's one of those albums that like if you want to sound like you're talking about something or whatever, you kind of say Nas is Illmatic. But like one thing I said with when it came to like listening to old school hip hop, when it came to me like going back in time, and I just thought about simplicity. That's kind of the one thing I really wanted to think about it, and not think about things being overcomplicated. And with rap music in modern generation, I think like it's no, if there are still rappers out there that do really well with storytelling, and they have really well like lyrically like that. They do really well. But I think a lot of times, rap can be used for like extra instrumentalism in a whatever like in a way that like the people that these rappers flows aren't necessarily to stand out against the beat but with the beat to stand in with the beat. But Nas's Illmatic, I think, is literally like the definition of like a very simple, basic, quintessential like East Coast album, for sure. And those are probably one of the first albums I bought. I think it would have been like yeah, it would have been like that. It would have been like 36 Chambers, and then it would have been The Chronic. It would have been like those three, because those are like the ones that everybody says. Those are the ones that all those lists had as like their top three consistently. And you find out why. You literally, when I listened to it, I remember like really falling in love with it, and it's not an arduous listening experience too. It's kind of, I think it's like 10 minutes long, or not 10 minutes, sorry, but 10 songs long. That's a short album if it was 10 minutes, but it's only like 10 songs, and each song really just kind of keeps moving, and they all have like a very similar kind of like vibe. They all have that kind of like. It's that funk, that soul jazz kind of like, very like it samples over heavy beats type thing. It's that classic boom bap sound, and but it works, and it was at that time it was like it was something that was new, even like posed against like what was else was East Coast rap. Sorry, I'm trying to like manifest the thought. But like like there was other artists that were already doing stuff in the East Coast before them, before Nas. And so like when he came out with this, it was kind of a little bit of a clash even against that. It was still using those jazz and soul samples and funk and stuff like that, but putting it against harder beats, better drum breaks, and just kind of like even adding like this, the crackly nostalgic sound that was like very popular with East Coast rap. And it just was like one of those things also where Nas, it just really, I think like he was so young, and it was like a statement right off the bat. Not too many people can do a freshman album like that. And so I consistently over the years, I've every time I listen to it, I just can't help but to put it up there. You know what I'm saying? I can't help but to recommend it and love it. And so this album was released April 19th, 1994. So literally mid 90s, and I think he kind of was recording it in the beginning of the 90s. And I know that maybe there was a little bit of like a delay on the on like releasing it, just because of like whatever, just making sure that things stay upright. And they did them right. I mean, they did Nas right when they released the album. He released it through Columbia. I recorded it in New York City, obviously, Queensbridge. And then the producers on this are kind of crazy. Like not only Nas himself, but he also had DJ Premier do like one or two tracks, I think. Pete Rock do a couple tracks. Q-Tip do a couple tracks. Like so, literally, like Q-Tip, like. So it's funny just to think about like all these like literally classic East Coast producers, and it's and people who are still relevant in like these upper echelons of hip hop and stuff like that. And the fact that Nas, like, I think that's a sentiment also is when the rapper has involvement with their production. You're building it from kind of like the ground up. You're building it from the beat up. You may know like your lyrics and you may have stuff written down and you may have stuff, kind of made up in your head already. But when you break it down from the beat up, it's like one of those things where it's like you can kind of know how to time things. And Nas really had like what kind of made it different at that time was definitely like he had a kind of a different delivery and more poetic, I think, than most rappers at that time. There was kind of a rhythmic thing to rap, and I know there's that classic, like kind of cliche, more so like sentiment of like, everything was so like on the beat with rap music, and that's what lyrics were kind of just like not super, unique, or like the least flows weren't super unique. And he came in with a kind of a new style and clever wordplay, and he seems so mature, and he definitely was someone that like for how young he was, he lived a hard life. And he for sure talked about like, as opposed to like Aquemini, like he talked about those harsh realities, but he talked about it, I think, as like a collective struggle, more so, not just as like an individual person and what how he felt, but like he knows that he is as just as one with everybody else. He's always kind of maybe like that's what the album feels like, is like he's just one of every other person. But he's just like a story. He has this like unique gift in the way of like Gab, like in storytelling. And so that's what I think he really does best is he portrays the harsh realities that a group of people have faced, along with him, the urban poverty and just the collective struggle and stuff like that. And I think the best songs on the album, I mean, pretty clichély to say, like, I keep saying clichély, like I'm really not trying to, but it is. But New York State of Mind is like probably like a top. I don't know if that's my favorite track, but that's definitely one of the best tracks, and for a reason. Really heavy production, and it literally like a story, like just like very clear, very derived, like. And then I probably would say like the world is yours, right? Probably. I love that beat more than I love of New York State of Mind. I think that one could be my number one. I would probably say that that one's a great beat. That one's, I think, and it kind of gives it's more like happy. It kind of gives this like lightness a little bit to the album. And then I would say that One Love, probably probably like another excellent song, and that's the one I kind of think of always like off that album. That's not like New York State of Mind or The World Is Yours, not like those top two songs. But One Love is an amazing song, and I remember like a few years ago he did this. He did like I think he did the album with like an orchestra backing behind it, and just a beautiful album. And that song One Love specifically, I think sounded pretty crisp and pretty clean. And so he, just produced a great album. Especially for like I say, he was pretty young at the time, and just how clear he was and how concise he was, and it was something that aesthetically was like against like West Coast was kind of popular more so at that time, and it was kind of like a trying to push more of a hardcore thing. Nas like in that boom bap sound, and even trying to get away from like the jazz rap sound that A Tribe Called Quest was doing, who is kind of the predominant fixture of New York hip hop or East Coast hip hop in general. And so what he was doing was just trying to like create something, and you could tell he had just like a different mindset about stuff, and what you could, it was just I think a general shift in hip hop in general. I think at that time it was like not only him, but then I think that became like the sentiment of like hip hop in general. It became like a lot harder, I think, towards the end of the '90s, and I think like you could probably thank him a lot to that. And those producers, like I said, like you put DJ Premier and Pete Rock and Q-Tip, who's one of my, like I said, not only a great rapper but a great producer. And Nas has been one of those guys that he's not one of those people that like he has these super diverse flows or something like that, or like he's not gonna sing up on too many tracks or anything like that, but like he has a very unique flow, and it's that poetic kind of substance to his like lyrics that make him very that make him long standing to me. It doesn't ever feel like he's like repeating anything. It doesn't feel like he's just copying himself. It very much so feels like that every time he's on the mic. It's the same guy, but it's like it's new. And even like nowadays, like the Disease albums, the King's Disease albums that he's put out with, I think Madlib. I keep thinking that Madlib was the ones that produced them. Maybe not. Maybe I'm stupid on that, but those are fantastic albums. Madlib is a long-standing producer as well, and so he stays good. Nas stays good, and he's gonna. And I will always go back and listen to Illmatic, and even like in subsequent albums, like as things were as it was written. Sorry, Nostradamus, which I always laugh. I love that album. I don't care. But he has a lot of great albums, and I think truly the king of New York. Whoa, controversial statement. All right. For my number three favorite album, I would probably a little another maybe a little bit of controversial because of how this man acts nowadays. But I threw this in because of like just like another influential thing in hip hop, and that's Kanye West's Graduation. I love Graduation. I absolutely do. I probably would say that it is like I mean College Dropouts, and when your first album is pretty great. That kind of puts like puts a signal out to the world that you're ready. And coming from producing for a lot of great artists before that, so it kind of gave him like a outline of how things work and a lot of confidence too. But and also like some Dark Twisted Beautiful Fantasies or whatever, like that album was fantastic. But truly, like when I think about Graduation, it was a pretty pinnacle place. Like it was just one of the many peaks that he kind of would maybe try to like, or at least he would say he would hit. But Graduation was made, yeah, September 11th, 2007. So, a few years after he kind of broke out, and like I think 2000 is when College Dropout came out, and then like a few years after that, putting out Late Registration, right? And then Graduation, and it was a whole like kind of like encompassing of like all these different styles, and then kind of an advancement in technology as well. Not only just be like a good producer already, but like showing the advancements in technology and your taste and stuff like that in music. And I think I probably discovered. I mean, I knew about Kanye West growing up. I mean, Kanye West was like a pop culture figure, so I knew about Kanye, but I didn't know like too deeply about like his music, his rap music, and his albums and stuff like that until I started listening to the hip hop, until I started listening to the genre. And you realize that like he had a hand in a lot of great songs, and not only his songs but with like other artists and stuff like that. And you realize that like he withstood the test of time for a long time, and even today still putting out great albums. And so Graduation wasn't the first one I bought, or wasn't really the first one I ever listened to. I think literally I think 808s and Heartbreaks was the first one I bought, was the first Kanye album I bought. And that one was fantastic, but that was already after like all these years of change and stuff like that. And also that was a dark time in his life. But then as I went back and I listened to like College Dropout and Late Registration, it was very much so like it was like those albums sounded like what hip hop sounded like in the early 2000s. So very much so I think attested to like how he was, and like who he was, and how popular, and how much ahead of the sound he was. But like I said, Graduation, when he put that out, like when I bought that, that was like I'd probably say like I don't know, like that would have probably been like I was like I really don't know, like I can't really actually remember buying that album. I have the album, but I just can't remember buying it. I probably was in my early 20s. Obviously, it was around like I said when I was throwing everything out the window. But I wanted to go back into the 90s when I first think like started listening to like old school hip hop, if you will. So like the 2000s wasn't really in my mind. But then as eventually like, you kind of move as you move backwards and then you move forward. And so I had to like close the gap. And Kanye just pops up like a bunch. So it was very much so like I was going to listen to his album eventually. And so when you listen to Graduation, to me it kind of like for sure sounds different than the other two. Like very much so like the other two albums are very soul gospel influenced, and I think there's like it's there's kind of a it's like a it's yeah, soulful. I don't know how else to really explain it. But it's the influences of what he listened to as a kid. Like he kind of brought gospel into hip hop, if you will, I guess a little bit. But this album with Graduation, he kind of is inspired by like stadium music, like stadium tours, like from like big ass rock bands like Def Leppard or the Rolling Stones or like the Who or something like that. And then as well as like electronic music, like VJs. And so he really wanted to make like an album that was like very like celebratory and like over the top and like stuff like that. And then like, with it using like heavily using like synths and like electronic sounds. And so it kind of went away from like soul samples to like building up, like using samples, but building like things up from that. Kind of creating all these like really complicated or like intricate, like, samples and stuff sorry, but also having people like T Pain on the album, and Lil Wayne and stuff like that, and Chris Martin on the album, pretty fantastic, I think. And I think John Legend pops up on one of the songs, right? He just like sings like a chorus or sings like a little hook or whatever. Drunken Hot Girls, I think that, and it's funny like all these absolutely fantastic artists in their own right at that time, and obviously T Pain was kind of an influence for Kanye on 808 and Heartbreak's the next album. Very heavily auto-tuned stuff. But he didn't really. It almost felt like he probably didn't even need all those like features. He's someone that like all those songs kind of feel a little bit different. It feel like their own experiences to the point where like he just makes it sound good just on his own. Why not take advantage of like having friends that want to? Also, Chris Martin. That's one of my favorite songs on the album is probably Homecoming. I don't think it's one of the best, but it's just funny to hear about Chris Martin, a British dude, singing about Lake Michigan, which is funny. It's just funny. But some of the best songs on that album for sure, I would say is, I mean, Flashing Lights. I would say that's like a pretty like big song, and it was probably the one that people most remember from that album. Maybe Stronger too. Maybe. I also I Wonder, which is a fantastic album song. I Wonder, the sample for that is by an artist. I keep if I mess it up, is I think his name is Labby Soufre, I think something like that. But he has another song that was sampled by Eminem for My Name Is, which is just funny, just like this one guy. But I mean, that's not. But also, that's a sentiment I think, like with a lot of things, especially with like the sampling, is there's some artists that just sound good, and there's obviously some that are like more available for copyright than others. And so you see some samples that are used more than others. But like sorry, excuse me. But he wanted to change it up a little bit. He definitely was, like I said, it was different from the his previous albums where it was more soulful and it felt a little more broken down. He wanted to make it epic. He also wanted to try to do a little more storytelling. I guess in that, I don't know if I would consider all those songs really like storytelling ish, but he got into like folk music, which I thought was kind of cool to just like include. I don't know how deeply, but folk music is known for its storytelling. So if you wanted to know about storytelling, why not just like listen to the music that's like based around it? And so it was definitely an album that also at that time with all the success built up was definitely kind of like an introspective album. Before I think like he was someone that like as most artists I think is it's a more of an observational kind of commentary. It's more like kind of what the social like welfare is, like what people are and how they act and in a shared poverty, kind of something that like Nas did in Illmatic. But in this album with Graduation, he really was introspective with it. It kind of felt like he was like it was more of a in a way kind of a braggadocious in a way, but also like really like being appreciative of like the things that he's achieved and trying to be inspirational in a way. And it like wanted to be epic, and you could tell just like how things are really built up in those out like in like a lot of the sense and a lot of those harder driving beats, and you could tell when you listen to like the album and you realize some of these influences, you realize that he was trying to achieve like an epic album. And so it really was like a peak. It was one of the first peaks, and I know that like after the Graduation, he was planning on putting out another album that was kind of just like Graduation. But due to some unfortunate circumstances in his life with his mom dying and just whatever else, he put out 808s and Heartbreaks, which was a totally different vibe than Graduation. But still a great album nonetheless, and an innovative album in its own right. But it would have been cool to think about like the other Graduation or whatever it would have been called. I know he had like a name for it. I keep forgetting what the name was for it. But it's one of those things where like it kind of the album not only reflected like a changing in hip hop in general and maybe something that you can talk about him being a pioneer in, but also a changing in his life. Graduation was kind of one of the big pinnacles in his life, and finally a time when he felt like he had like some stability and some like traction trying to make it through the music industry. And I know that like nowadays I don't take Kanye West seriously. It's I can't even listen to what he says, right? I can't look at what he does, and I just don't want to. And I probably have even slacked on listening to his albums, like like newer albums. He popped up like when I started listening to rap and stuff like that. Like he was around, like he was putting out albums actively, and so I definitely love a lot of those albums at that time, and even some of the newer stuff that he like, like stuff like at the time was like Life of Pablo. That was a great album, or Kids See Ghosts. That was a great album. And so like I'm glad that I got to research my stuff before and not be totally dissuaded before I even like listen to anything. And I'm always going to try to separate the artist from the art. That's something I talk about a lot is like you got to realize that like someone now may not be who they were then. Maybe, but maybe not. So I'll just keep Graduation at face value. I'll let it be kind of like what it is, and I'll let it be just itself, be the album that it is. Yeah, but I got to give it up to Kanye for doing a lot for hip hop at that time. All right, for my last song on, or not my last song, but my last album on the list, my number four out of my top four rap albums is I'm gonna do the Low End Theory by A Tribe Called Quest. Um, another amazing kind of old school classic like East Coast album. Like I said, I kind of maybe I push towards more of that sound a lot more. I'm more of into that boom bap East Coast sound and a lot of those kind of harder like soul samples and jazz samples and stuff like that. And I really enjoy that sound. And 100% Tribe Called Quest was an innovator in that sound. They were some ones that even before they put out the Low End Theory, like when their first album, they innovated that sound. They really were heavy on using those jazz and soul samples and really bringing like this kind of nostalgic like kind of sound to it in the way of like this crackling and the surface sounds they had on it and stuff like that. And A Tribe Called Quest, I discovered probably like it was one of those like probably the first couple times like I went out and bought a few albums. Like I remember the first one I bought was their first album, People's Indistinctive Travels and Paths of Rhythm is what it's called, and that's an amazing album. And that did a lot for me too. But I also felt like it was like very much so like a product of like the late '80s, kind of like that style of hip hop. And excuse me, and it didn't like and it kind of was good, but I had already listened to like Wu-Tang and I already listened to Nas, and so it wasn't as that hardcore as I wanted to. And so I was swayed away for a second. And then when I jumped in to listen to like the Low End Theory, it was a little more a little more hardcore. It was still it's still not aligned with like what Nas was doing, but like and it became out even before Nas, but like it was one of those things where it felt like it was a little harder and the beats were a little bit harder and obviously I think like a unifying of sound and stuff like that. But this album came out September 24th, 1991, and it was Jive Records, which I kind of heard of Jive Records. I don't really know much else about Jive Records, but that's an old school like name. Done in New York, and producers was literally Q-Tip himself, and then as well as their DJ Ali Shahid Muhammad, which he gets shouted out on a bunch of their tracks, which is always funny. And then you gotta also say the other member, kind of the big member of that group is Fife Dog. Rest in peace, Fife Dog. But this album was kind of a pinnacle in a way of like, or like not necessarily pinnacle, but it was really the unification of all these sounds that they kind of had been working on. And it's heavily influenced by jazz music, which I think people really I think liked at that time. A lot of people credit the Low End Theory, I think, to like connecting jazz to the modern day listener, making people kind of being like an appreciative thing towards jazz and not a contradictory thing. And Q-Tip, it's a testament. I love producer rappers and Kanye West being one of those guys and stuff like that. And so Q-Tip, I mean, like all over each song, and like that builds and there's a certain rhythm to these songs. And this album also, it kind of had a lot of like, um, not controversies because that'd be kind of weird to say, but like behind the scenes stuff was like they fired their manager and like lawyer at the time, and so that kind of put everything up in the mix, and then kind of created some tensions with what was known as the Native Tongues Collective, which also included De La Soul and Queen Latifah as well as others. And so there was kind of some tension building up behind the scenes, and then they also needed that they wanted like an advancement and stuff like that to keep putting out this album, and there was a little bit of tension with Jive and stuff like that, and so it immediately kind of put a pressure on them to succeed. And then also Fife Dog found out he had diabetes at the time. And so he wanted to quit. It was one of those things where like his, kind of freaked him out a little bit. But then instead of him quitting, they just promised him like, hey, like let's put you fully involved. And when you listen to like, their first album, like I don't think you really notice that Fife Dog's not super prevalent in those songs. But then as you listen to this album, he's like in every single verse, like he's all over the album. And I think that only does like great to the album. And it showed that he was ready. For sure 100% ready to like record and ready to do stuff and really raise to the occasion. And I think it really is two guys or three guys. I mean, when you consider the DJ, but it's guys these guys that really wanted to create something influential and still one of those things, a simple kind of broken down sound, 100%. Also, a kind of thing I didn't know that I thought was kind of cool was the album name, the Low End Theory, is kind of like a double symbolism kind of thing. Not only for like what the bass frequencies in rap music was at the time, kind of that low end bass, like nothing really plucky, but that kind of low like humming end of the bass sound, as well as like like a perception of black men in society, which I thought that was kind of a cool thing. Something that always they've always done is try to be a little like conscious about that kind of stuff. And they've always mixed, I think, a lot of like not only good wordplay and good poeticness, but they've done a lot of humor, and they have a lot of fun when it comes to these songs, and I think that really shows through pretty heavily. I think it shows that they have like they're able to lyrically produce good social commentary on things while having good fun with it, but while still giving it its justice. And 100%, I always think of like it wanted to sound like a live album, and it kind of does with like through its recordings, and they use like using like like basic bass and basic drums. It doesn't sound super layered, which is kind of gives it that live sounding experience a little bit, kind of. But 100%, it was a start for a long venture for them. They again, but also like not I guess not that long, because they disbanded I think like 1998 or something like that. They put out one album, the Love Movement was what that album was called, and that was it. That was all of Tribe Called Quest really. And then we'd kind of get back together and do performances, and Q-Tip was involved in songs. I think Five was involved in other things, and Q-Tip is one of those guys that like he produces, like I said. So and not only is he a good rapper, but he's a great producer as well. And so so he was gonna withstand I think the test of time anyways, working with other people and stuff like that. I didn't mention my favorite songs. So I think the best songs on this album is Excursions, which is like the first song on the album, which is an absolutely fantastic like I think like showcase for the sound for that like very like like broken down simple sound, heavier, a little more up pace, like jazzy sound. And then I would say 100% that like Check the Rhyme is like a very classic song, something that also that Q-Tip and not Big Boy, sorry. Q-Tip and Fife Dog do is they bounce off each other a lot. It feels like they can intermingle like verses really well, and it feels like they're kind of like talking to each other through the song. And so that's something that like shows through on like a song like Check the Rhyme. And then Scenario, I would say, is probably like that's probably my favorite song on that album, probably. And not only for like good verses by Fife and Q-Tip, but like they have a couple guest features, specifically one of them being Busta Rhymes, which is so funny. And Busta Rhymes probably got one of the best verses like on all that album on that song, and I would definitely suggest people go listen to not only the whole album, but that song and listen to Busta Rhymes. And if you're someone that like enjoys like modern hip hop, and you might recognize a line that few of those lines, like you might, but specifically Busta Rhymes, you might recognize a certain line. But yeah, and 100%, just think about how like early in the 90s that was, and still how like how much so that it's such a relevant album. And I love it. Yeah, when I first listened to it, it wasn't the first like Tribe Called Quest one, but it was something that got me excited to listen to them again, and or like wanted to like dive into them more so. But yeah, so I would say that's probably my top four favorite albums. Just to recap, my number one is Aquemini by Outkast. Number two, I would say, is Illmatic by Nas. Number three is Graduation by Kanye West, I would say. And then number four on my list, I had The Low End Theory by Tribe Called Quest. And I always say, like I said, like the number one and maybe number two, I can probably confidently say those are my number one and number two. But with everything else, I'm always interchanging. It's sometimes I like come across the albums again, and I know that a couple other albums that I wanted to put on there was like I know that like I really do enjoy I enjoy the score by the Fugees. Like I love that album, and even like more modern albums, Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City, like that's a very great album, and even To Pimp a Butterfly, and then Drake being one of my top favorite rappers, like Nothing Was the Same was an album that I feel like it's like kind of maybe not his best, but I feel like it's one of those albums that just like started this whole like era of Drake, I think, or like kind of like pushed the narrative on Drake. So in future episodes, I know I'm gonna keep talking about this stuff, but like for first episode, I can confidently say these are four albums that for sure I could put as like my top favorite albums, or at least can talk about in the list or whatever. But yeah, what are some of y'all's favorites? If any, it doesn't even have to be rap music. Like I think that's kind of a hard thing to think about in most genres. Like I would love to like think about like other albums that I really listen to, but rap was like the first kind of like genre of music that I took that deep dive into, and I tried listening to the albums, and that's something that I like to do now. Is kind of like it's kind of carried over into like I like listening to albums, and when artists put out new albums and they put out new things, and I like to listen to the whole thing. I like listening through the album and not just look at like not just the singles and the songs that stick out. But sometimes that's what gets you interested in those things. So yeah, so I don't know what else to say really. I want to keep on evolving, and and if anybody else has like certain artists that you love, like I suggest them. I'm someone that I'm always trying to. I just always sometimes think about things, and I'm always trying to think about my favorite stuff, but it's really hard. And I might not have listened to. I haven't listened to every album, so if any, I'm always looking up for suggestions too. But yeah, that's pretty much it for episode 8, I would say. Just like I said, I'm trying to switch in between. Like right now, I want to do like 2 a week, and I might try to do more. But I want to try to switch off in the episodes. Do one episode that's a little bit fun, like this one, and something that's kind of like a little more entertaining, and a little more research or whatever. And but then also do the episodes that hit a little closer to the heart, a little more deeper in the brain, and stuff that do with mental health or just the general the feelings I have and stuff like that. That's what we do here. Discuss the everyday odd thoughts. That's what we do. But anyways, I'm gonna stop talking. I feel like this is a good end for the episode. But I appreciate everybody for tuning in. If you guys enjoyed it, then I'm gonna put this up on YouTube. That's where I put all my podcast episodes is up on YouTube. The channel is called The Odd Thoughts Podcast. So if you want to go listen to this episode and other episodes, go check that out. And then if you want to follow me on different social medias, I have on Facebook I am Gunther Getlicker. That's my name, and both the G's are capitalized in that. And then with Instagram, Instagram it's Gunther_Getlicker. Both of those G's are lowercase. And then you can follow me on Twitter at one Mike GG. Sorry, kind of threw myself off a little bit there. But anyways, I appreciate everybody for listening. If you are someone that that enjoys this type of content, then keep letting me know. Keep show it to other people. Like I'm just trying to build this as much as possible. But anyways, thank you all for listening, and please enjoy, and just remember, everybody, be excellent to each other.